December 22, 1944 dawned cold and merciless over the snow-covered town of Bastogne, Belgium, where 10,000 American paratroopers found themselves surrounded by an entire German panzer army. Yet when rescue came knocking, they would deliver one of the most defiant responses in military history. The morning fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest as Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in his cramped headquarters, studying maps that told a grim story. His 101st Airborne Division, rushed to this critical crossroads town just 4 days earlier, now faced 25 German divisions bearing down from all sides. The Nazi Wehrmacht's winter offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had caught Allied forces completely off guard, and Bastogne, a hub of 7 vital roads, stood as the lone obstacle preventing German armor from racing toward the Meuse River and splitting the Allied front in two. McAuliffe's men had been celebrating in Reims, France, recovering from their brutal jump into Holland during Operation Market Garden, when urgent orders arrived on December 18th. The division, still under strength and lacking proper winter equipment, loaded onto trucks with whatever ammunition they could grab. Many paratroopers wore summer uniforms beneath thin overcoats as they rolled toward Belgium, unaware they were heading straight into the maw of Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, had launched its surprise attack on December 16th with over 400,000 troops and nearly 1,200 tanks. According to accounts preserved in the United States Army Center of Military History Archives, the initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise, overrunning American positions and creating a bulge in Allied lines that would give the battle its name. As referenced in historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive documentation, the German High Command believed they could reach Antwerp, capture the vital Allied supply port, and force a negotiated peace in the West. But Bastogne stood in their way. The town's 7 roads were essential for moving armor and supplies, and von Manteuffel knew that bypassing such a strong point would leave his flanks dangerously exposed. He had to take Bastogne, and he had to take it quickly before American reinforcements could arrive. McAuliffe's paratroopers, who called themselves the Screaming Eagles, transformed Bastogne into a fortress, despite lacking adequate anti-tank weapons, winter clothing, medical supplies, and artillery ammunition. They established defensive positions in the frozen earth, using whatever materials they could scavenge from abandoned buildings. The temperature plummeted to well below freezing, and the thick cloud cover that blanketed the region grounded Allied aircraft, cutting off any hope of resupply or air support. By December 21st, German forces had completely encircled the town. The Panzer Lehr Division pressed from the south, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division from the north, and various other units tightened the noose from east and west. Radio communications with higher headquarters became sporadic. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The aid stations filled with wounded men, but morphine and bandages ran dangerously low. Yet the paratroopers held their positions, repelling probe after probe by German infantry and armor, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would define not just the battle, but the very soul of the American airborne soldier. December 22, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag of truce, carrying a document that would produce the most famous one-word response in American military history. The German delegation, led by 2 majors and accompanied by enlisted orderlies bearing the flag, made their way through the frozen landscape toward the American positions at the southeastern edge of Bastogne. They were intercepted by Lieutenant Leslie Smith and Private Ernest Premitz of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Germans, speaking through an interpreter, indicated they carried an important message for the American commander. They were blindfolded and escorted to the command post of Major Alvin Jones, who commanded the 2nd Battalion. The ultimatum, typed in English on 2 sheets of paper, was formal and threatening in its tone. It demanded the surrender of Bastogne within 2 hours, warning that without capitulation, the German forces would employ their full artillery and air power to annihilate the American garrison. The document invoked humanitarian concerns, suggesting that continued resistance would result in unnecessary casualties among the civilian population and American defenders alike. It was signed by the commander of the German forces encircling the town. Major Jones read the document with growing disbelief, then immediately sent it up the chain of command to division headquarters. When it reached General McAuliffe in his basement command post at the Heinz barracks, the 56-year-old West Point graduate barely glanced at it before responding with a single, incredulous word that would echo through history: nuts. His staff officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, found the response perfectly appropriate, but worried the Germans might not understand the American slang. As they drafted the formal reply, debate ensued about whether to elaborate or provide translation. McAuliffe decided the brevity was perfect. It conveyed exactly the contempt he felt for the demand. The official typed response read in full: to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the honor of delivering the response. He returned to where the German officers waited, still blindfolded, and handed them the paper. When the German captain asked for clarification of the meaning, Harper leaned close and said, "It means go to hell." Then, as the bemused Germans prepared to depart, Harper added with a grin, "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officers returned to their lines, and the ultimatum expired without American surrender. True to their word, German artillery intensified their bombardment of Bastogne. Shells rained down on the town throughout the afternoon and evening, demolishing buildings and creating casualties among both soldiers and civilians. Yet the paratroopers and glider infantry held firm, their resolve hardened rather than weakened by the enemy's threats. News of McAuliffe's defiant response spread rapidly through American lines, transmitted by word of mouth through frozen foxholes and makeshift command posts. The men of the 101st Airborne, who had been fighting without respite for days in sub-zero temperatures with dwindling supplies, found renewed determination in their commander's simple refusal. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and freezing. But they were not defeated. Back at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower had already set in motion plans to relieve Bastogne. He ordered Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army to disengage from operations in the Saar region and wheel northward in a daring 90-degree pivot to strike at the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton, never one to shy from aggressive action, promised to attack within 72 hours. A timeline many considered impossible given the weather, terrain, and logistics involved. December 23, 1944, 50 miles south of Bastogne, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton Jr. stood before his corps commanders in the ancient Luxembourg city that bore the country's name, promising what many believed impossible: relief of the besieged garrison within 3 days. Patton's Third Army had been driving eastward into Germany's industrial Saar region when Eisenhower summoned him to Verdun on December 19th for an emergency conference. While other generals presented cautious plans emphasizing defensive consolidation, Patton shocked the room by announcing he could attack northward with 3 divisions in just 48 hours. He had anticipated the order and secretly prepared contingency plans, demonstrating the aggressive foresight that made him both celebrated and controversial among Allied leadership. The military maneuver Patton proposed defied conventional wisdom. His army would have to disengage from active combat, pivot 90 degrees, move over 100,000 men with all their vehicles and equipment along icy roads through Luxembourg, and then assault directly into the flank of the German offensive. The Third Army's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, had worked with Patton to develop 3 separate attack plans depending on where Eisenhower wanted the Third Army to strike. The chosen plan, codenamed Nickel, called for Major General John Milliken's Third Corps to lead the assault toward Bastogne. By December 22nd, the massive redeployment was underway. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, would spearhead the relief effort. This division, one of Patton's most effective units, had earned a reputation for aggressive armored warfare during the summer campaign across France. Its Combat Command B, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose name would later grace America's main battle tank, would form the tip of the spear driving toward the encircled paratroopers. Patton's headquarters established direct radio contact with McAuliffe's command post in Bastogne, coordinating the relief effort and providing intelligence on German dispositions. The Third Army commander personally radioed messages of encouragement to the besieged garrison, promising that help was coming. His confidence was infectious, though privately his staff worried about the numerous obstacles facing the relief column. The German forces between Patton's positions and Bastogne were formidable. The 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, battle-hardened paratroopers loyal to the Luftwaffe rather than the army, had established strong defensive positions in the towns and villages along the approach routes. Supporting them were elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, including heavy Tiger tanks whose 88mm guns could destroy American Shermans at ranges where return fire proved ineffective. German commanders recognized that if they could delay Patton even briefly, they might starve out the Bastogne garrison or overwhelm it through sheer weight of numbers. Weather remained Patton's greatest enemy. The same thick cloud cover that prevented Allied air support from aiding Bastogne also grounded close air support for the Third Army's advance. Roads covered in ice and snow, limited mobility, and channeled armored columns into predictable routes that German anti-tank gunners could easily target. According to military records maintained at the National Archives, the temperature hovered around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, causing weapons to freeze and vehicles to break down with alarming frequency. Yet Patton drove his men forward with characteristic intensity. His forward command post moved constantly, staying close to the action as he personally visited units to inspire and cajole. He met with division commanders, inspected positions, and famously ordered his chaplain to compose a weather prayer asking for clear skies, a prayer he then had printed and distributed to every soldier in Third Army. December 24, 1944. Dawn broke over Luxembourg as Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division began its bloody advance toward Bastogne, fighting through 9 miles of determined German resistance that would cost hundreds of American lives. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, led his Shermans north along the Arlon-Bastogne Highway, designated by military planners as the primary relief route. His force consisted of approximately 50 medium tanks, supported by armored infantry, tank destroyers, and artillery. They advanced in column formation, vulnerable but necessary given the narrow roads and dense forests flanking their route. Every village became a potential killing ground, every woodline a hiding place for German anti-tank guns. The first major obstacle came at Martelange, where German engineers had demolished the bridge over the Schur River and established defensive positions in the town. Abrams' tanks engaged in a brutal firefight with enemy positions, while combat engineers struggled to construct a temporary crossing under fire. The delay cost precious hours, and casualties mounted as German artillery observers called down accurate fire on the stationary American column. When the advance finally resumed after midnight on December 23rd, the tankers knew they faced similar resistance in every town ahead. Meanwhile, Combat Command A under Lieutenant Colonel George Jacques attacked along a parallel route to the east, attempting to draw German forces away from Abrams's main effort. They encountered even stiffer resistance near the village of Biegenville, where elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division had prepared elaborate defensive positions. The fighting devolved into close-quarters combat as American infantry dismounted from their half-tracks to clear German positions house by house while tanks provided covering fire. Back in Bastogne, the besieged garrison celebrated Christmas Eve under artillery bombardment. Supply levels had reached critical lows. Artillery batteries rationed shells to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medics performed surgery with improvised instruments, and infantrymen huddled in frozen foxholes without adequate winter clothing. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. The men of the 101st Airborne could hear the distant rumble of Patton's guns to the south, proof that relief was attempting to reach them. The weather, which had grounded aircraft for over a week, finally broke on December 23rd. Clear skies appeared for the first time since the battle began, and Allied air power immediately made its presence felt. Over 200 C-47 transport aircraft descended on Bastogne in successive waves, dropping supplies by parachute, while German anti-aircraft guns blazed away from surrounding positions. The supply drop brought ammunition, medical supplies, and food, though much of it landed outside American lines and had to be recovered under fire. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force attacked German positions around Bastogne's perimeter, striking armor concentrations and supply columns with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. German troops, who had enjoyed freedom from air attack during the cloudy weather, now found themselves hunted from above. American defenders, who had felt isolated and abandoned, took heart from the sight of friendly aircraft overhead. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division from his headquarters in Luxembourg, monitored the slow progress with growing frustration. His forces were fighting magnificently, but German resistance proved more tenacious than anticipated. Every mile gained cost men and machines. Tank losses mounted as German 88mm guns picked off Shermans at long range. Infantry casualties accumulated in the brutal close-quarters fighting required to clear villages. Gaffey radioed Patton's headquarters requesting additional forces, but Third Army resources were stretched thin across multiple attacks. Major General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps and Major General John Milliken's 3rd Corps were both engaged in heavy fighting along the southern shoulder of the German penetration, preventing reinforcements from being shifted to the Bastogne relief effort. December 26, 1944, 4:45 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, crashed through German lines into the village of Assenois and made radio contact with the 101st Airborne, ending the siege of Bastogne after 9 days of encirclement. Boggess, a 23-year-old officer from Chicago, had spent the previous 48 hours fighting through the small towns and villages south of Bastogne. His platoon, reduced to 4 operational tanks after days of combat, formed part of Lieutenant Colonel Abrams's final push toward the besieged garrison. The attack plan called for a narrow penetration along a single road, accepting risk on the flanks to achieve breakthrough speed. Artillery would pound German positions ahead of the advance while fighter bombers struck deeper targets. The assault kicked off at 3 in the afternoon on a bitterly cold day. Boggess's tanks, accompanied by armored infantry from the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, rolled north from the village of Remy-Champagne toward Assenois. German resistance was fierce but disorganized. The speed of the American advance caught enemy units off guard, and many defensive positions found themselves bypassed before they could effectively engage the column. As Boggess's lead tank entered Assenois, German infantry emerged from buildings with Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank rockets that could disable a Sherman with a single hit. The American tankers responded with machine gun fire while infantry dismounted to clear the buildings. House-to-house fighting erupted throughout the small village as American forces pushed toward Bastogne, now visible less than a mile to the north. At approximately 4:30, Boggess's tank crested a small ridge north of Assenois. Through his periscope he could see foxholes and defensive positions ahead. But were they German or American? He ordered his driver to advance slowly while he stood in the turret hatch, making himself visible and vulnerable. Then he saw the distinctive star markings on a nearby medical jeep and figures in American uniforms emerging from their positions. Boggess radioed back to Abrams's command tank. Contact with the 101st Airborne, negative resistance. The lieutenant's calm announcement belied the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. The siege was broken. A narrow corridor now connected Bastogne to friendly lines, allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow into the town while wounded could be evacuated. The paratroopers who met Boggess's column were men from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion and elements of Team O'Hara from the 10th Armored Division, a small tank unit that had been attached to the 101st when the siege began. They had held the southern perimeter against repeated German attacks, and now they witnessed the arrival of Patton's forces with mixed emotions. Relief that supplies and reinforcements had arrived was tempered by something else. A fierce pride in what they had accomplished and a determination to make clear they had never needed rescue. General McAuliffe immediately established radio contact with General Gaffey's headquarters. The conversation was professional and cordial, with McAuliffe expressing appreciation for the supplies and reinforcements. But when Gaffey suggested that the 101st could now be relieved by fresh units, McAuliffe's response was firm. His division would continue to hold Bastogne. They had defended it when surrounded. They would defend it now with an open supply line. This response reflected a sentiment that permeated the entire 101st Airborne Division. The paratroopers had been sent to Bastogne to hold a critical position, and hold it they did. They had endured German artillery, armor, and infantry assaults, while outnumbered and undersupplied. They had rejected surrender when given the opportunity. They had no intention of abandoning their positions simply because help had arrived. December 27, 1944. As supply trucks rolled into Bastogne along the narrow corridor opened by Patton's forces, tension emerged between the relieving Third Army units and the paratroopers who had held the town, revealing a clash of military cultures and profound questions about the nature of rescue versus relief. General Patton himself arrived in Bastogne on December 28th to personally congratulate the defenders and assess the situation. His meeting with McAuliffe was cordial but revealed fundamental differences in perspective. Patton, never modest about his accomplishments, spoke of rescuing the 101st Airborne from a desperate situation. McAuliffe, equally proud of his division's performance, politely but firmly corrected the characterization. His men had never been in danger of defeat or surrender. They had simply been temporarily isolated while accomplishing their mission. This distinction was not mere semantics to the paratroopers. The term rescue implied they had been victims requiring salvation, helpless defenders awaiting a more capable force to save them. The term relief acknowledged they had successfully completed their mission, holding Bastogne, and were now receiving logistical support and reinforcement to continue that mission. The difference carried profound implications for unit pride and military reputation. According to accounts preserved in military histories and veteran interviews archived at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, the friction between airborne and armored units became palpable in the days following December 26th. Third Army personnel spoke openly about rescuing the surrounded garrison, while 101st troopers bristled at the characterization. Fights broke out in aid stations and supply points as tired, cold soldiers from both commands clashed over credit for the victory. The disagreement reflected deeper cultural divisions within the American military. Airborne units considered themselves elite forces, specially trained and selected volunteers who took pride in operating behind enemy lines or in isolated positions. They were accustomed to being surrounded. It was practically their standard tactical situation during combat jumps. The notion that encirclement implied distress or desperation contradicted their fundamental identity as paratroopers. Armored units, particularly Patton's Third Army, took equal pride in their aggressive offensive operations and rapid maneuvers. The 90-degree pivot from offensive operations in the Saar, the rapid movement north through terrible weather, and the breakthrough to Bastogne represented remarkable achievements that cost hundreds of casualties. 4th Armored Division had fought through determined German resistance for 4 days to open the corridor. They had earned recognition for their accomplishment. Complicating matters was the undeniable fact that Bastogne's defenders had been in genuinely difficult circumstances before relief arrived. Artillery ammunition had been so scarce that batteries were restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies had run critically low, forcing surgeons to operate without adequate anesthesia or antibiotics. Food stocks had dwindled to the point where men received 1 meal daily. Winter clothing remained inadequate, contributing to hundreds of cases of frostbite and trenchfoot. Yet these hardships had not broken the garrison's fighting spirit or capability. Every German attack had been repulsed. The defensive perimeter, though pressured, had never been breached. Radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations revealed that German commanders considered Bastogne an impregnable fortress that could not be taken by assault. When the corridor opened on December 26th, the 101st Airborne was still a fully functional fighting force capable of offensive operations. The controversy extended beyond the immediate participants. Press coverage of the Battle of the Bulge emphasized Patton's dramatic relief operation, playing to his reputation as America's most aggressive and successful combat general. Newspaper headlines proclaimed, "Patton rescues surrounded garrison," and similar formulations that infuriated airborne veterans. War correspondents, seeking dramatic narratives for homefront consumption, naturally emphasized the siege and relief rather than the more complex story of successful defensive operations. General McAuliffe addressed the issue directly with his division in the days following relief. He commended the 4th Armored Division for their fighting advance and sacrifices, but made clear that the 101st had accomplished its mission independently. The division had been ordered to hold Bastogne, and it had held Bastogne. The subsequent arrival of supplies and reinforcements enabled them to continue holding Bastogne, but the fundamental mission had never been in jeopardy. December 30th, 1944. As German forces launched renewed attacks attempting to cut the Bastogne corridor, the 101st Airborne's insistence on remaining in the line reflected deeper truths about military culture, unit cohesion, and the psychology of elite forces. The narrow corridor connecting Bastogne to American lines remained vulnerable to German counterattacks throughout late December and early January. General von Manteuffel, recognizing that the town's continued resistance prevented exploitation of the Bulge offensive, committed fresh units to severing Patton's supply line. Panzer divisions struck from east and west, attempting to isolate the garrison once again. Artillery fire rained down on the single road carrying supplies and reinforcements into town. Third Army planners, recognizing the precarious situation, proposed rotating the 101st out of Bastogne and replacing them with infantry divisions from Patton's command. These units were better equipped for static defensive operations, possessed more artillery support, and had not endured 9 days of siege combat in sub-zero temperatures. The proposal made tactical sense. Relieve exhausted airborne units with fresh conventional infantry, while the paratroopers rested and refitted for future offensive operations. General McAuliffe rejected the proposal outright. His reasoning combined tactical judgment with profound understanding of military psychology. Tactically, his paratroopers knew the terrain intimately after days of defensive combat. They had established effective fields of fire, registered artillery targets, and developed working relationships with attached armor and tank destroyer units. Replacing them with unfamiliar units would sacrifice this accumulated tactical knowledge during a critical period when German counterattacks threatened daily. More fundamentally, withdrawing the 101st would send the wrong message to both American forces and the enemy. It would suggest the Airborne Division had reached its breaking point and required relief. Exactly the narrative McAuliffe rejected. His men had proven they could hold Bastogne under the worst possible conditions. Withdrawing them now would undermine that accomplishment and damage the division's reputation as an elite force capable of sustained independent operations. The psychology of airborne forces amplified these concerns. Paratroopers volunteered for hazardous duty and underwent rigorous selection and training specifically to operate in situations conventional infantry avoided. Being surrounded, isolated, and outnumbered represented normal operating conditions for airborne operations. The Normandy invasion, Holland operation, and now Bastogne all involved these conditions. If airborne units required rescue whenever they encountered such circumstances, their entire purpose and identity came into question. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who served as McAuliffe's operations officer throughout the siege, later explained in interviews archived at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center that the division's reaction to relief efforts stemmed from a carefully cultivated organizational culture. The 101st Airborne prided itself on being the military's premier division. This pride was not mere arrogance, but a carefully maintained esprit de corps that enabled men to endure extraordinary hardship and danger. Anything that diminished this pride threatened unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The enlisted men shared their officers' sentiments. Private Donald Burgett, serving with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, recorded in his memoir that troopers took offense at suggestions they had needed rescue. They acknowledged appreciation for ammunition, medical supplies, and hot food, but insisted they had never doubted their ability to hold the town. The arrival of relief forces meant they could continue their mission with better logistical support, nothing more. This perspective was reinforced by the actual tactical situation when the corridor opened. The 101st had not been on the verge of collapse or surrender. German attacks had been repulsed throughout the siege. The defensive perimeter remained intact. Ammunition was scarce but not exhausted. The garrison had endured hardship but remained combat effective. From the paratroopers' perspective, they had successfully completed an extremely difficult defensive mission. They had not been rescued from impending disaster. The distinction mattered enormously to how veterans would remember and describe their experience for decades afterward. Bastogne became synonymous with the 101st Airborne Division, a defining moment that validated their elite status and demonstrated their capabilities. Had the narrative become one of desperation and rescue rather than successful defense and relief, the psychological impact on the unit would have been profoundly different. January 13, 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge officially ended with German forces withdrawing from the salient, the question of rescue versus relief at Bastogne crystallized into a legacy that would define the 101st Airborne Division for generations and illuminate fundamental truths about military honor, institutional pride, and the nature of victory. The battle's final casualty figures told a sobering story. American forces suffered over 80,000 casualties during the 6-week battle, including 19,000 killed. German losses exceeded 100,000, with Hitler's last strategic reserve destroyed in the Ardennes forests. The 4th Armored Division, which had fought through to Bastogne, lost over 1,000 men in the relief operation. The 101st Airborne suffered approximately 1,500 casualties during the siege, with hundreds more hospitalized for frostbite and trench foot. Yet the statistical accounting could not capture what Bastogne represented to the American military and the broader war effort. The successful defense of the town had disrupted German offensive timetables, denied critical road networks to enemy armor, and provided a rallying point for American forces during the Wehrmacht's last major offensive. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower recognized the 101st Airborne's accomplishment by awarding the division a Presidential Unit Citation, the first time an entire division received this honor during World War II. The citation's language was carefully chosen to reflect the nature of the achievement. The 101st Airborne Division, although surrounded, vastly outnumbered, and subjected to constant ground attacks and intense artillery fire, prevented the enemy from penetrating the vital Bastogne-Namur road net. The word rescued appeared nowhere in the official recognition. Instead, the citation emphasized successful mission accomplishment under extreme conditions. Precisely the narrative McAuliffe and his troopers insisted upon. General Patton, to his credit, eventually moderated his rhetoric about the relief operation. In private correspondence and later memoirs, he acknowledged the 101st had performed magnificently and had never been in danger of surrender. His Third Army had provided critical supplies and reinforcements, but the Airborne Division had held Bastogne through its own determination and fighting skill. This acknowledgement reflected Patton's genuine respect for capable soldiers, even as it contradicted his preference for dramatic narratives emphasizing Third Army's accomplishments. The debate over terminology, rescue versus relief, might seem like mere word choice, but it reflected profound truths about military culture and individual psychology. Soldiers in combat endure extraordinary hardship and danger in part because they believe in their unit's capabilities and their own effectiveness. This belief system, carefully cultivated through training and reinforced through shared experience, enables men to function under conditions that would otherwise break human spirits. Anything that undermines this belief system threatens combat effectiveness more surely than enemy action. The 101st Airborne's insistence that they were relieved, not rescued at Bastogne, preserved this essential psychological foundation. It validated their suffering and sacrifice by affirming they had successfully completed an extremely difficult mission. It maintained their elite status and institutional pride. Most critically, it established a narrative that future paratroopers could embrace as part of their unit's heritage, a story of successful defense against overwhelming odds rather than desperate survival awaiting rescue. This distinction shaped how veterans remembered and discussed their experience for the remainder of their lives. Interviews with Bastogne veterans, conducted decades after the battle and preserved at institutions including the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, consistently emphasize successful mission accomplishment rather than hardship and rescue. Veterans describe holding their positions, repelling attacks, and maintaining unit cohesion. They acknowledge the relief operation brought welcome supplies but insist they never doubted their ability to continue the fight. The legacy extended beyond individual memory to institutional culture. The 101st Airborne Division carried the Bastogne campaign streamer on its colors and incorporated the siege into training and tradition. New soldiers joining the division learned about their predecessors' refusal to surrender or seek rescue. This heritage shaped expectations and reinforced the division's identity as an elite force capable of independent operations under adverse conditions. The story of Bastogne became inseparable from the unit's conception of itself. 80 years later, the question, why did the 101st refuse to be rescued by Patton at Bastogne, reveals its answer not in tactical considerations, but in the deepest values of military service, mission accomplishment, unit pride, and the indomitable human spirit that enables soldiers to endure beyond reasonable limits. The paratroopers at Bastogne were never rescued because they never needed rescue. They needed ammunition, supplies, and reinforcement to continue accomplishing the mission they had been assigned. When those arrived, they continued fighting with the same determination they had shown while surrounded. That simple truth, preserved in their refusal to accept the language of rescue, stands as their most enduring victory.